Alright everyone, it's time for Occult Literature video number 142, Aryan Sun Myths. Now this is more about the religious side than the ethnic side of this particular, late 1800s, early 1900s, very much in vogue subject of people talking about it for half a century. Talking about the origins of sort of the European people. In this case, though, it's literally the origin of religions. Link in the description to my edition of this work on Amazon, second and third to my books blogs. You can find other academic works of a similar nature in the academic category there. You can also find similar works in the spiritual category, I believe, but some of the theosophical writings are similar. Now, we have to look at this in terms of the interest of the public in the time in self-improvement. Number one, looking back at the past to try to inform the present and then future sort of ties into the millennial aspect of Christendom at the time. And so Christians especially were looking back, they were beginning to practice the occult explicitly. Your great-grandparents, I pointed this out with Nick Fuentes, I referred to this text, your great-grandparents, if you're a Christian, sometime in the Victorian, they probably practiced dark magic. They probably tried to summon demons. There's a pretty damn good chance that they did. They just then chose not to talk about it so much during the relatively moralistic period of the Depression, sort of falls out of favor. World War II happens, the atomic era rises, and then the old spirituality sort of dissolves until roughly the modern period. We're talking mid to late 2000s. Certainly until the end of the 90s. The occult renaissance was very much not in play. There was a sort of quasi-occult renaissance of the 60s and 70s with a lot of drug use, but that's really hippie new agery. A lot of that's not exactly authentic. It's play acting. It's a sham. It can be very cute, but it's a sham. It's like, oh, yeah, I'm going to practice this authentic Mesoamerican religion. This dude who totally looks Native American, he's actually just an old hippie dude, gave me a bunch of crystals and told me about the Hopi or something. He gave me drugs, basically. So he invented a new spirituality, claims it's authentic. Spirit told him so. This particular work is significant in that it talks about dozens of different instances of historical individuals, Tacitus, Pliny, some of these others, speaking about paganism, about the sort of cultish solar aspect. In many cases, the overlap with Christianity. Of course, you don't get that with maybe Julius Caesar, but latter-day individuals you certainly get, in many cases, admitting that paganism, its trappings, its symbols, its practices and holidays certainly overlap with Christendom. For instance, according to historical writers, Jesus, assuming that such a central historical figure existed, would not have been born around the winter solstice. But that's when it's celebrated, specifically because of the overlap with pagan ideology. Easter. Easter as a religious holiday according to Christendom. It's not a Christian holiday. It's literally a lunar festival that celebrates sex and alcohol and things of that nature. By the way, there are a lot of mushrooms and wine going on in some of the northern areas of the barbarian world around the winter solstice at the time. It's basically, hey, let's get high and drunk. There's nothing else to do. There's no sun. And we're hoping the sun will come back, so we're going to have an orgy so we can have children in the subsequent year, when it's relatively warmer. It'd be a great time. It's what they did. It's what Easter's all about. Easter's basically like fucking reproduce. But this text goes further. It goes into Hinduism, Buddhism. It speaks a great deal about Mithra and Krishna, especially as those two figures. You do have a relative lack of some lore, because you've got to understand when this book was written. Some of these particular cultures weren't known about quite so much as they are now. There's less Egyptology going on in the late 1800s than today. Less of it was known about. You've got the Rosetta Stone, I believe, by this time, but you don't have quite as great an understanding. Not everything was, some of it was still in translation. You certainly don't have a great deal of lore about Sumeria. You know a bit about Babylon, but not necessarily those that came thousands of years before. You didn't have Göbekli Tepe, you didn't know existed. A lot of these ruins hadn't been found or were very new and, not completely studied at the time. So it's not 100% complete by modern standards, but the basic principles are definitely true. The Christian religion, largely, its symbols and holidays are based on pre-existent pagan groups. That's not to say that it denigrates from the concept of, Christianity is true. No, maybe the paganism is true and you're just using different words to describe this deity. Okay, some Christians, by the way, claim that. But definitely they didn't invent the concept of celebrating on the solstice. Celebrating Easter, using the Christmas tree or something. So it's an interesting work. Very, very worthy, touches on dozens of pagan cultures. I find that, generally speaking, around this period, you have a great deal of interest, especially with Hinduism. So that tends to be the one that's covered the most. This one branches out, though, a little bit further. It talks a little bit more about the Mithras and the Bacchuses. It goes into some Greece and Rome as well, which was also in vogue, but when you're talking about this kind of text, generally it's a heavy fixation on Hinduism. If you look at the phallic worship texts, other than those that touch upon physical remains within like the British Isles or something, it's almost all about Hindu and Muslim lore at the time. It's basically Arabia to India, sort of this area. It's being explored. People are interested in these cultures. They had encountered and quantified Mesoamerican lore. They had encountered and quantified, Eastern, sort of the Orthodox, more out there tribal practices, Italian witchcraft with Leland, some of the North African groups, and they knew about Rome and Greece, but still, for the first time in many cases, some of these weird stories were coming out of India and surrounding areas, and they were interesting because to many people they were totally new. You also have, around the end of the 19th century, an extreme rise in the literacy of the middle-class population that was burgeoning at the time. Thus, you have a greater literary audience. Many people, they hadn't encountered any foreign culture before, and they didn't travel quite so much. They relied upon sort of the scientific or spiritual texts that were being written about others that were doing the exploring. And people in the military, in many cases, are mentioned in some of these works as legitimate sources. Those that were capable of speaking the lingo, so to speak. Legitimate sources of religious lore, folklore, compilations were quite common, especially in anything the British were involved in. The British were number one in compiling the folklore. So, if it pleases the Queen, I would like a sum of money to go exploring in the jungles of Thailand. I think back then it would have been Siam. and I intend to compile this folklore of the native people. It's quite interesting. You should see it. "Oh, yes," says the Queen, "and I will give you plenty of tea for your voyage, young man." And it's basically what happened. It was great for science. It wasn't always accurate, but it was interesting anyway. So very, very good work. I had fun editing it because I was reading it twice, going through it. By the way, I removed the footnotes. They were superfluous because most of those are already in the text. The rest are in notes at the end. It was pointless. It's literally like double noting everything for the benefit of a scientific reader, but most of the readers that will be reading my edition probably you're not studying religious history. You're probably not a PhD in this subject. You're probably, you're just interested in the subject. Maybe you're an occultist. And for you, if you're into the occult, if in any of that occultism has a sort of Abrahamic basis, you need to understand the pagan origins of Abrahamism. Otherwise, you totally err. You won't know anything. You're not going to raise any demons. Let's just say that. So again, link in the description of my edition of this work on Amazon, second and third to my books, blogs. Lots of academic titles. If you're into more of the out there sort of anthropology side of the academic world, I think there are about a dozen different works from that. And that's, not including the phallic titles. That's about all. Peace out.